You set foot on foreign soil. Only this land isn't ruled by any country or government. In this land, we celebrate music. In this land, we celebrate games. In this land, we celebrate those who compose video game music. Welcome to the VG Embassy. Welcome and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the VG Embassy. This is a show centered around video game music and the amazing online community of fans and podcasters that enjoy it. My name's Ed, and on each episode I'll take the role of Prime VGM Minister and invite a guest VG Ambassador onto the show to share with us their own video game music culture, or I may share a part of my culture on a solo show. And today's show is a mirror image of a show that we did almost a full year ago. Episode 6, back in August of 2018, we did Dark Sci-Fi with Emily. And now Emily is back with me for her take, or her preference in sci-fi, I guess you could say, which is the lighter, more fluffy side of sci-fi. Emily, welcome back to the Embassy.
Hi, thank you. I just parked my spaceship right on your front lawn. I hope that's okay.
That's fine, because this is the light sci-fi universe, so there's no...
there are no problems with that.
There's no space pirates. There's
right.
Nobody's going to be trying to destroy your stuff here, so we're good.
Excellent, yes. So I've just rolled up in my spaceship with beveled edges and shiny silver, and I'm ready to go.
Excellent. So, why don't we talk a little bit about the differences in sci-fi? Because we talked a little bit about this, I guess, about a year ago when we recorded the first show together. Dark sci-fi had more of a film noir feel to it. Things were futuristic, but also kind of falling apart. So what do you define as kind of a light sci-fi subgenre?
Yeah, so good question, because this category is completely made up. This is just a thing from my mind that may have kind of a fluid definition. So I think one of the fun things today on this episode will actually be seeing whether or not all of these picks qualify as light sci-fi, depending on my own rules or what you think or what, the other embassy visitors think. I would really love to hear people weigh in on this. But
yeah, me too.
So from my thinking, first I should point out, when I say light sci-fi, I don't necessarily mean it as a contrast to hard sci-fi, which is a term that exists, which means like very grounded in scientific reality sci-fi. Hard sci-fi would be like actually explaining how everything works and making sure that all the science checks out. But when I think of light sci-fi, I'm thinking of stories in which there is a strong sense of good and bad. There are good guys and bad guys. It's clear. There isn't a whole lot of gray area necessarily. I think that bad guys and badness are not necessarily considered the default state of being. You really believe in the good in these stories and you hope that it will triumph, but it's not going to be a story where you're examining, humanity really bites and all humans are terrible. You know what I mean?
Right. It's more Ninja Turtles and less Breaking Bad.
Exactly, right. Or, exactly. Or whatever race or species you're playing as, not the default state of being will not be evil or bad. I think it's focused on kind of like bigger ideas like diplomacy and theoreticals. So not so much the nitty gritty. In the dark sci-fi, it was kind of, we were like on the city streets. We were seeing what technology was doing to the average person and kind of looking at all of the ways that technology could kind of go wrong. And I feel like that it's a blurrier picture, I guess, is how I would describe it with light sci-fi. We're not necessarily going to be, in the drug-infested quarters of an overrun Earth that we've industrialized to the point of horror.
That's a good point, and that brings up a good thing to talk about, is that in these future worlds, there might be dark sci-fi and light sci-fi stories going on at the same time. You know, you might have a pristine spaceship out exploring the stars, but then back on Earth, there's both, you know, gleaming metropolises, but also really seedy Shadowrun style underbellies that they don't talk about.
That is a fantastic point, actually, because another thing that I thought kind of qualified as light sci-fi was a heavy focus on space exploration and being in space and the loneliness of space. So you're right. I mean, all that stuff is going on in the background. So maybe a lot of it has to do with the vantage point of the story. If you're on the spaceship of the person going off colonizing another world, maybe that's light sci-fi, even though back on Earth, that same Federation that funded that spaceship is ruining everything. But we just don't focus on it. So, you know, that's part of it. You know, that's kind of, I guess the only other point I would bring up, and this is just something that I realized from like looking at these different games, I think that there, ironically, a military component also makes it light sci-fi in my mind. Not necessarily military, but like Federations, thinking about like the Star Trek, you know, Starfleet.
Organization. Yeah, there's a rule book that people play by.
Kind of.
It always seems to be in light sci-fi.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that's kind of, and it's also that group is usually seen as being reasonable, even if you kind of step back as the audience and you go, wait a minute, no. But that's the vantage point of the narrative, is that like the rules should be followed. There's a right way to do things. And if you kind of persevere along that, things will be okay.
Yeah, and people don't necessarily feel oppressed by the rules. Everybody just kind of agrees that these are common sense. We still have our own autonomy. We still have the ability to think freely, but nobody really wants to cause anybody harm. Everybody kind of wants to work together. I think that's a major component of it, too.
It could be. So let's see how many of these tracks are going to contradict everything we just said.
We should have been making a checklist as we went.
I know. I have a little bit of we'll see. It's going to get interesting.
Awesome. So, what do you want to start with first as a good indicator of what you're talking about here?
So the track I want to start with is one that will be familiar to a lot of people, I think. This is from Mass Effect, the original Mass Effect for the Xbox 360, PC, PS3, and it is called Uncharted Worlds. And the music to this game was composed by Jack Wall, Sam Hulick, Richard Jacques, and David Cates.
All right, we'll be right back. All right, we're back. That was Uncharted Worlds from Mass Effect. That came out on the Xbox 360, the PS3, and PC in 2007. Composed by Jack Wall, Sam Hulick, Richard Jacques, and David Cates. Sam Hulick was the composer who worked on this song in particular. And it was a great first track, I think, to play for this episode because it really just kind of builds and makes you feel like a universe is kind of beginning, or you're being introduced to something grand. Like I can imagine spacescapes or a time lapse of an Earth rotating around and the sun rising and falling, and it had a very minimalistic but very kind of important feel to it to me. Yes,
those are wonderful descriptions. Yes, this is actually a map screen, kind of. As you are choosing which planets and which galaxies you want to travel to in your you're highlighting and you're moving your ship around. Although I can't remember if you actually move the ship literally in this game. I know you do in the other games, but this is what plays. So you might be thinking carefully about where you're going, or just kind of like getting an eye for the system that you're in. So this is what's behind all of that. So very much kind of imbuing in you the feeling of expansive space. And I picked this track. This is one of the fan favorites on the soundtrack. This is a very important track to a lot of people. And it was actually recycled in later games. And by recycled, I mean they bring in the motif a little bit on the map screens in the subsequent games, which I think is also an indicator of how important that track was. And when you play those games, you're like, oh, there it is. When you hear like a little bit, you just get really excited about it. But another reason why I picked this track is because it is something that I listened to for a very long time, because in Mass Effect, in I think all of the games, but particularly in the first one, you can examine every planet in a star system, even ones that you can't land on. So when you highlight it, there'll be a little description of it. So just flavor text about like, this planet used to be the home of this particular pirate group, but they've since disappeared and nobody knows why. And you can see debris floating around in the atmosphere. And then it'll give you like how long the days are, how many years it takes for it to go all the way around its sun.
Oh, neat.
All this kind of stuff. And I read every single planet description in full. And I don't just mean the description. I mean, I sat there and I really tried to think about what it would be like to live on a planet where a day was 5 Earth days, or it took 100 years to go around the sun, and just sort of thinking about what a society would be like that had those as its milestones. How would they separate their time? Would they have celebrations for things that are different from what we have based on the position of the planet, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I love those details. So they cut back a little bit on that in later games, but so I can't even, I wish I could know how many hours I spent listening to this track as I was like, oh, surface temperature of blank degrees. That's really interesting,
That made me wonder if a day on a planet was like 5 Earth days, do you think the species would spend like 100% of the time awake and then sleep for like 5 of our days straight? Or would it be like, would they be awake for like 80% of the time and take like 20% naps during the day and then sleep 80% of the time and be up for like 20% of the time during the nighttime? Like,
oh my gosh, Ed, welcome to my world.
I couldn't imagine being awake for 5 straight days. Of course, I guess if you lived on that planet and were born on that planet, that would be normal to you, but...
Right, yeah.
The
species might have evolved to take that into account, or if we went there, we might come up with different ways of marking it. I mean, who knows? There could be other planets you could see in the sky, and you mark your time by, the quadrant of the sky that they're in, or something like that. But this is what I think about all the time, and that I think about as being a very... To me, that's very light sci-fi. I'm definitely not saying that dark sci-fi doesn't have world building, but I think light sci-fi has a lot of like these sort of infinite possibilities, and sort of examining these things spreads outward as opposed to narrowing down to some sort of problem or something. And again, I don't really know what I'm saying. I'm trying to find words for what's in my brain. But yes, I wanted to set the mood with this feeling of just expansive black space of possibilities, and thinking about how different cultures and species and whatever would interact with all those new exciting variables.
So Mass Effect, from what I know of it, because I haven't really played much of it at all, always kind of struck me as being a little on the darker side and not as light, but that's just probably my lack of experience talking. So what about this game puts it in the light category for you?
So I think you're right. I mean, we just spent a lot of time talking about following the rules, and the Mass Effect games revolve around characters that are above the rules, literally. So your character, minor spoilers, it happens very early on in the game, but your character, Commander Shepard, becomes what's called a Spectre. And a Spectre is basically a free agent that is recognized by the Galactic Council, but does not answer to the Galactic Council rules. These are the off-the-map folks who do what has to be done to protect civilization, basically. So the story revolves in the first game around your character and another Spectre who's gone rogue. So you've got a doppelganger who's just as smart as you are, who is, above the law, who's respected and not suspected for quite a long time. And so you're engaged in that kind of a battle. But so as to why I would consider it light sci-fi, a couple things. The first game feels very lonely. There's a lot of planetary exploration where there's nothing on a planet except for a tiny, tiny little colony. And I love that feeling of loneliness. There's also, this is something that I didn't bring up earlier. There's kind of an underlying feeling in Mass Effect about being against xenophobia. And so what I mean by that is Mass Effect is about the coming together of different alien races to try to help each other, as opposed to one trying to take over. And so your team that you gather around you has a representative of every or many major races that all have their backstories and their problems and their histories with each other, but your team comes together to do something that couldn't be done without all of you working on the problem as one.
Okay.
So the first game is not about like humans are the saviors and humans are the best. So, and that I really appreciate. But yeah, there are a lot of dark components, but also there is a definite black and white with good and bad, and the bad is kind of an eldritch horror situation, which is sort of interesting. But I think the lightness in the first Mass Effect comes from the aesthetic, from the bonding together of these different alien species against a common threat that is a threat to everyone. But there are definitely dark pieces in the history, and the later games, the first game might seem more light in contrast to the later games, because particularly Mass Effect 2 goes in the dark sci-fi direction. I would put that solidly in dark sci-fi, because you go to like the planet that has no rules and is like the den of murderers and drug users and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So that's it. So I would go there and I'd find you hanging out.
Right, exactly. I'd be sitting there at the bar,
nightclub. Yeah, exactly.
Looking for trouble.
Yeah, in the red light of the neon, with the pounding bass of the music. Exactly.
Exactly.
So. But yeah, so it's again, it's iffy. So my gut puts it in light sci-fi, but it may not be.
I think when things are dark, you really, really know if it's dark, because it's almost unquestionably dark. Of course, it's a gradient too. There's going to be stuff that's kind of skirting the lines between both. But from what you're describing, yeah, I think you're on the money there, putting it more in the light.
It kind of makes me wonder also if a lot of it has to do with the delivery. So we were talking about vantage point. In Mass Effect, there are things that have happened in galactic history that are really terrible. There's genocide and things like that. But since we are beyond that point, and that's sort of a thing in the past that we've sort of overcome, but still has ramifications, maybe it has to do with how that's kind of in ancient history, and we're trying to all get along now. But if you actually had a Mass Effect game set at that time, it would be dark sci-fi, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think things need to have gotten dark in order for it to be light. You have to have come from something in order to have a positive future. So I think a lot, even like Star Trek, the Federation has had its dark times in the past as well. So there's always going to be, something to compare it to. You have to come out of your cocoon.
Yes. Oh my gosh, hold on to that thought, because we're going to talk about that later. That's excellent.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm very excited about this episode.
So yeah, I know Mass Effect is like one of your favorite series ever. So what made you want to pick something from the first game over the soundtracks from the other ones?
The first game is above and beyond my favorite. I like the other two. The other two are fun to play, and most people love the second one the most. But the first one really, really connected with me, and I actually have this really ridiculous headcanon. Do you want to indulge my headcanon about the series?
Go for it.
Okay. So I feel like, and I don't want to spoil anything, but I played the first game as a paragon. Oh, by the way, there's a very strict morality system where you either do the diplomatic thing or the blunt thing. Let's put it that way. So I played my first run through very, very, very diplomatic. And when I started the second game, there's something that happens very early on that made no sense to my character. I was literally watching my Commander Shepard do and agree to things that she never would have based on what she'd seen in the first game, and I felt very, very strongly about that. So I had this very weird, disjointed feeling right away. So my headcanon, I just think, I enjoyed the games. I'm not saying that I was upset or disappointed. They just went in a different direction. I think that made sense for different gameplay styles. But so my headcanon is that the first game really happened, that was really historically the story of Commander Shepard, and then Commander Shepard then sold the rights to her life story, and then some group decided to make more games based on like extrapolated adventures of Commander Shepard that had
Shepard
nothing
the
to
game.
Yeah, that had nothing to do with anything that really happened. So I actually started writing this really dumb fan fiction of Commander Shepard finishing the third game and putting down the controller and just being like, what was that? With like all the other characters around her being like, well, it was kind of cool, but like none of that stuff happened. And Commander Shepard being like, where did they even get that idea? So that's my funny little take on it, that the 2 and 3 were kind of like serialized moneymakers off of the name and legend of Commander Shepard, but that they aren't rooted in historical fact.
I like it. I could totally agree with that. Poor Shepard. I mean, I hope at least she made some money off the deal, so.
That's right, I know.
All right, want to move on to our next track?
Yes, let's do it.
All right, what do we got?
So we've got, we actually in this episode have a mix of games that I have played and haven't played. So this is one that I haven't played. This is a game called Star Cruiser. And this was on the Mega Drive, the PC-88, the PC-98, the Sharp X1, and the Sharp X68. Thousand? Okay. Never really. Whenever I see Sharp and then stuff after it, I'm like, oh no, I'm going to pronounce it.
Is it 100? Is it million?
Yeah, I'm going to say it wrong and everyone's going to be like, man, she doesn't know anything. So yes, thank you. And this was composed by Toshiya Yamanaka and Osamu Nagano. And we're going to be listening to the track Red Zone.
Cool.
And this is the Sharp X1 version. Blast off.
For adventure. Alright, that was Red Zone from Star Cruiser from the Sharp X1. That also came out on the Mega Drive, the PC-88, the PC-98, and the Sharp X68000. around 1988. I'm sure they all didn't come out the same year. That was composed by Toshiya Yamanaka and Osamu Nagano. Wow, this is a great track. Very hidden gem.
Oh, I love it so much.
Especially the Sharp X1 version, which I've heard the Mega Drive and the X68000 versions of this soundtrack, but the X1 was one that I hadn't listened to, and those chords are amazing. This has such a rich FM feel to it. I'm really glad you played this one.
Oh, thanks. This was an interesting one to pick because I did listen to all the different versions, and they all brought something else to the table. And it was interesting because they were different enough that they really felt sometimes even like different songs. I forget which, I think it was the PC 88 or 98 or possibly both, that had a much slower tempo. One of the versions had a much slower tempo and it felt like a totally different song. The Mega Drive, I think, is a little bit faster than this one, but it has, kind of a tinniness to the percussion.
Right.
And this one is just so like soft and warm. It's just wonderful. I just loved it. It was just this perfect combination of everything that I wanted. Oh, what a beautiful tune.
Yeah, I think the fact that there wasn't any sampled percussion in this one is what kind of makes it better in a sense, because it allows you to focus more on those chords and you don't have the drums drowning out all the other instruments like what happens a lot on the 68000. So it just kind of gives you a little extra chance to appreciate the breadth and the warmth of that tone, especially that long drawn out chord, like right towards the end. It's really cool.
I love that chord. I just said when you were describing, the percussion of the other systems. I was totally just going, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm just like, Ed knows what he's talking about, so I'm just going to agree with his expansive knowledge on these sound chips. So
I know a little bit about those. Nah,
just
I'm no
a little
expert,
bit,
but
teeny tiny bit.
So how'd you find this one?
I'm not sure. Let me think. Oh, you know what? I think I did it roulette style. I think I actually typed in star into my library.
Oh, cool.
And just saw what came up and found this track, which I loved, and then looked up the game to see if it would actually fit the category, which it's time to play. Is this light sci-fi? Because I'm not sure, right?
Right.
Okay, so let's pick this apart. This is what Star Cruiser is about. Star Cruiser is about humans and aliens finally having peace after a long war.
Okay.
But that the Earth's Federation and a military nation called Void have decided that they're going to deport all the aliens and take over the galaxy.
That's not cool.
No, it's not.
Take over the aliens galaxy?
I think just take over the whole galaxy.
We're all in the same galaxy already? It's kind of vague on this one?
Something like that. I don't know if they're exiling them specifically from Earth or what.
Or the entire galaxy.
It's a little bit unclear from the intro. But yes, we have someone, two groups trying to actually break up a peaceful accord among different species and then kind of use that weakness to swoop in and take over. Gotcha. So to me, this is a little bit confusing because number one, I feel like, and we were talking about this a little bit over the break, and I wanted to come back to that excellent comment you had about having to go through the dark sci-fi period before you get to the light sci-fi. So here we've achieved a utopia, and now something is threatening that utopia. But the threat is actually coming partially from the inside, which is interesting to me. It's not about some other race trying to take over necessarily. I mean, the Earth Federation is in cahoots with this effort. So we have some discontented folks on our planet who do not like this peaceful agreement and want to kick out all the aliens that have come to live with us and work and live alongside us. So I really think it could kind of go either way depending on how you feel about it. So based on what you know of the story, and I don't know if you looked at any gameplay, but we're listening to the music. What do you think, Ed? Where would you put this one?
Well, the gameplay doesn't really... I mean, the story is just kind of a backdrop to an action game, right? Because the gameplay is kind of like Star Fox 2 or something like that, where it's just a very kind of rudimentary polygonal, you're a ship kind of floating around these 3D areas and shooting things.
Yes.
So you kind of have to take the story at face value. So it's hard to, because you can present this story in two different ways. You know, you can have a very kind of structured military style conflict, and you would consider it kind of a light sci-fi kind of a thing, or it could be a very kind of gritty, everybody swearing at each other. It sounds like because they've already been a utopia, that the people that are going to be involved will be of a more civilized manner, at least the protagonists. So I'd probably put it more in the light sci-fi, because it's obviously high-tech. There's nothing falling apart. It's not like every man for himself anarchy.
Right.
It's two factions that are at war with each other, and that doesn't really lend itself to kind of the Firefly or, you know, Blade Runner style every man for himself nature of the dark sci-fi stuff.
Great examples. I'm sitting here trying not to giggle too much over the comment of everyone swearing. But, like, that's true, right? You know, when I think about dark sci-fi, I think about people swearing. I think about everyone smoking, you know, bars.
Right, yeah. Captain Picard's never going to call anybody an a-hole, you know? It's not the way it works in those universes.
Right, I know. So that's really funny. But yeah, so I think, and I think also, too, we still very clearly here have a good grasp on who is fighting for good and who is fighting for bad. We are on the good side, and also it kind of goes back to that theme of everyone trying to get along, because we are on the side of keeping everyone together and not deciding to commit genocide or displace an entire group of people. So I think that's an interesting, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I feel like that theme is going to come up again and again in light sci-fi, that the good side is on the side of keeping everyone together and, you know, diversity and being
Unity.
mindful of differences. Yeah, exactly. And becoming greater than the sum of our parts, as opposed to one group having a tyrannical control, you know, whether or not the story presents that as actually good.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because as a Japanese developed game, you know, the Japanese their culture's kind of known for always being wary of foreign cultures, and to have this be kind of like the main component of their story and being very anti-xenophobic, it's very progressive for a Japanese game, especially in the 80s when it was kind of like at their height of xenophobia. Like, they're a little more, I think, open now with the more global economy and the internet kind of allowing them to get out of their shells a little bit. I don't want to speak for Japan because I don't know 100%, but, you know, it seems like, especially from what I hear from people who have visited there in the 80s, that it was very difficult for a non-Asian looking person to kind of get around without stares, and it's not so much nowadays. Right,
and they had very strict rules on who could visit for a very long time and all of that, and then think about, you know, what they went through as a nation during World War II,
right? And
how much of an impact that had on their media. It just comes up again and again in anime and things. Not just the giant explosion mimicking the atomic bomb droppings, but the idea that militaries are corrupt or there is no good side to the military. I have a really good friend who goes by Gunstar Green online, and he was explaining the story of one of the Gundam anime. And basically, both sides were terrible. Both sides of the different military organizations were bad, essentially. There was that's gray area. So that would be dark sci-fi.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
But yeah, so very interesting point there about this. Everybody's swearing. So that's just, yeah, okay, yes.
It's like, you know, if you're on the fence and it's a movie or something, and within the first 5 minutes somebody drops the F-bomb, you're like, boom, dark sci-fi. It doesn't matter. The rest of it could be all like rainbow robots shooting hearts at each other, but it's dark sci-fi. You just lost it with that one F-bomb.
Yeah, it's also kind of like if you know, within the first 5 minutes, if you're on a spaceship and everything is like polished and there are beveled edges, might be light sci-fi.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, with that said, why don't we move on to track number 3 of the night? What do you have for us?
Okay, another game I've not played. This is from the game Star Ocean for the Super Nintendo. I think this actually was only released on Super Famicom.
Yeah, Japan only.
Okay. Composed by Motoi Sakuraba, and this is Ancient Ruin.
All right, that was Ancient Ruin from Star Ocean that came out on the Super Famicom in 1996 originally, and then got released on the PSP as a remake in 2008, composed by the man, Motoi Sakuraba. So one thing I wanted to mention about the music that you picked for this episode, some really challenging stuff to like rip and find really good quality versions of, which I love a challenge, and
sorry.
I love getting like really complicated music. So thank you for that. But this is one of the few. This is one of the few Super Nintendo soundtracks that aren't compatible with that standard. They call it SPC, the standard kind of chiptune files. You have to get an additional player for this SNSF format and then play it through there, because the music had so many parts and such long samples that they had to like load some samples in as the song played and then grab other samples from the game's memory as it was playing. It couldn't load it all in at once, so there was some special trickery they had to do. So that makes this game kind of unique in how the Super Nintendo handles the music. And you can tell, I mean, there's a lot of really cool stuff going on in this track. Maybe not this one in particular, but there's some other stuff with like vocals and like really cool parts to them in this soundtrack.
I'm so sorry that I gave you a challenge, but it's making me smile because I feel like we just, in this episode, enacted that very classic Star Trek situation where the captain is like, engineering, I need this done. And you're like, okay, give me 8 hours. And I'm like, I need it in 3.
I can't do it, Captain.
Yeah. You're like, I need a special player for this. And I'm like, do it.
I don't have the player. I have the worst Scottish accent in the world, but
get it done, Scotty.
So how did you come across this one? Because I know you mentioned that you hadn't played it. This is actually in my queue. I am on this RPG kick lately.
Ooh, cool.
So I started with Marvelous, which was a really cool kind of non-action style RPG that only came out in Japan on the Super Famicom. Then I just went through all of Seiken Densetsu 3.
Nice.
Now I'm in the middle of Chrono Trigger.
Nice.
And so I think Star Ocean might be my next one, because I'm trying to pick ones that are like popular, but not necessarily like the most popular games. I know Chrono Trigger's a not good example of that, but Star Ocean's always been one that I've kind of been curious about and don't know much about. So I think that'll be my next one on the list. And based on what I've heard from the soundtrack, it's going to be a fun ride already.
That's pretty excellent. It's exciting that you're going through all those RPGs. You're getting all those classics under your belt and then also seeing all these influences.
I feel like there's so much that I've missed. Yeah.
So this one came about again from, casting about with my roulette wheel for the Star. So Star Ocean came up. And I was particularly intrigued. I mean, I've heard music from this game before, but I'd never looked into what it was about. And so I thought it was really cool that apparently the creators cited Star Trek as a direct influence. And also, it had this... it's one of those interesting sci-fi fantasy combos. So the Wikipedia entry actually said that Star Ocean, the original Star Ocean, included fantasy elements in an attempt to appeal to a wider audience, which I think is a really interesting thought, but that subsequent games in the series went more sci-fi and kind of got away or relied less on the fantasy elements. So I thought that was very intriguing. And I did want to talk about the kind of conflagration of sci-fi and fantasy, because this happens a lot, and there are a lot of opinions on this. So I dug up two quotes that I thought were interesting from two different authors. So we have Orson Scott Card of Ender's Game fame, who said, quote, "Science fiction has rivets on the cover and fantasy has trees." But then you also have Terry Pratchett, who was primarily a fantasy author. So Orson Scott Card was sci-fi. Then you've got Terry Pratchett, who's usually considered fantasy, saying, quote, "A lot of science fiction is fantasy with nuts and bolts painted on the outside."
Right.
So you've got these two opinions about, is it really about the aesthetic, or, is it about the story, the underlying story, or is it about the look? So I just thought that would be interesting to talk about, possibly.
I think sci-fi has changed over the years, and especially since these quotes were minted or said or printed or whatever you want to say.
Yep.
Because nowadays you look at series like Black Mirror or a lot of the short sci-fi films that you'll find on the web, and a lot of them are about how we as a people are putting too much of our faith in technology or getting addicted to our phones or things that can happen that make us disaffected and not part of the like ruining the human condition. And you don't really see a lot of that in fantasy. Fantasy is like adventure. So Star Wars is a sci-fi adventure that kind of fits that fantasy with nuts and bolts painted on the outside.
I would
but is there really
agree.
a fantasy? Is there like a fantasy analog to Star Trek? Like Lord of the Rings would be people that are going from one place to another and visiting different areas, but I don't know if that really
it's kind of like
jives. You couldn't really conflate them,
You'd need to have something like Harry Potter, where wizards are actually learning how to do their spells, but you need to actually discuss that. You know what actually might get close to that? Oh my gosh, I can't remember which tabletop game it is because I can never remember which one is which. But there is actually a tabletop, I think it's a White Wolf tabletop universe that is magic oriented, but magic is treated in a very scientific way. So it's like to push something with magical force, you have to pull that energy from something else to be able to expend it that way, if that makes any sense.
Neat.
So you have to be cognizant of...
So physics still apply.
Yeah, you have to sacrifice something. Or this might be kind of like maybe Full Metal Alchemist gets there with the concept of, to create something with magic, an equal but not equal but opposite, but an equivalent trade has to be made.
Right,
an equivalent sacrifice has to be made to bring about this magical result.
Right.
So maybe, but yeah, I get what you're saying. It's not quite the same.
Yeah, and then there's things like Shadowrun, which is kind of like ham-fisted, just smooshing sci-fi and fantasy. Like, let's have orcs and hackers and hacker orcs. Sure, why not?
Yeah, exactly. That's really interesting. Your take on the sci-fi changing is really interesting, because something that has definitely happened as we've gotten more advanced technology that almost mimics the things that used to be in older media that seemed so magical is now commonplace. So you can't just, I mean, they still do it. I still watch movies where they bring up a hacking sequence and it's scrolling through the numbers. And I'm just like, that's not how that works.
Right,
you can't do it that way. You can't lock in every subsequent number in the sequence as you go. But as technology has become more, and I mean like fantastical technology, I guess I would call it, just to distinguish, as it's become more prevalent, more accessible to everybody, and more normalized, it's not the magic, Deus Ex Machina that it used to be, or you don't just accept, oh yeah, technology, magic, anymore. So sci-fi is kind of now just examining, they're sort of starting from the point of, we have this technology, what does that do to us? As opposed to, here's a story, let's bring in this piece of technology that's going to do this fantastic thing to get us to the next point.
Right. How can it go good? How can it go bad? I mean, and then there's also things like 1984, which is kind of less sci-fi and more dystopian, but it still takes place in the future. And, I don't really know if there's any sort of a fantasy analog for that either. So I don't know. I think these comments or these quotes are, and I guess they both say some sci-fi, so they're not really saying all sci-fi to begin with, but I don't know if, I think I would have agreed with it much more strongly when they were said versus now. And at least the sci-fi that I'm into myself personally is the type of sci-fi that would not necessarily translate well to a fantasy world anyway. Like, I'm not a fantasy guy. The whole genre just kind of never excited me that much. So I think maybe that's why my sci-fi predilections are more towards stuff that wouldn't work well with magic and, arcane runes and stuff like that.
Right. Interesting. Well, I'll be really interested to hear how you feel about this game. Can I give you minor spoilers?
Oh, go for it.
Or do you not want to hear?
No. That's totally fine.
Okay.
It's the experience that matters, not necessarily the story as much.
Excellent. So, in terms of the light sci-fi elements, I do think that the story of Star Ocean seems to be very light sci-fi. It's about 3 friends who are searching for a cure to a disease, basically.
Okay.
There's some kind of space federation, there's some kind of war, there's time travel, but I think that it's revolving around this finding a cure to help a planet is very light sci-fi-ish. But what I'm really interested in, and I cannot wait to hear how your playthrough goes, is that I guess this game was ahead of its time in the way you could influence the storyline with your actions and
cool.
dialogue choices. I didn't read into it too much, but they called it the actual influencing moments had a certain name that made it seem like it wasn't necessarily obvious.
Okay.
So it wasn't like you came up across a point that was like, what do you do? Do you blow up the building or do you save everyone inside? So that's very intriguing to me. That sounds very, very cool.
Nice. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it because I've heard very good things about it. And there is a fan translation out there for the Japanese version. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Excellent.
Very cool. We didn't talk too much about the music itself, but I got a very prog rock, almost kind of like a Led Zeppelin feel to this one, I think, with some classical elements. There was some really cool stuff going on. Did you just pick this track at random, or did you choose this particular track?
Oh, no, I chose it.
Okay.
Because I really thought it was awesome.
What drew you to it so much?
I think the build-up hooked me right away, so I stayed with it for a long time. And also, I mean, give that bassist an award, please. That bass line is awesome, and it just keeps going. But I really loved how this track went in a lot of different directions. And I was really trying to find examples of different musical profiles for this because, we started with Mass Effect Uncharted Worlds. You can find so much stuff that is just like that.
Yeah.
That is drawing influence from those sort of spacey arpeggios and kind of very long chords. Sci-fi is typically, in my mind, very FM synthy anyway. So, I wanted to represent a whole bunch of different systems in different styles to sort of get a full profile. So that's my answer.
Sakura was definitely known for his bass lines, like El Viento, Ernest Evans, Annette Fudutabi, fantastic FM bass lines, and he translated them really well to the Super Famicom.
Yes.
So, all right. Do you want to move on to our next one?
Let's do it.
All right. What you got next?
Our next track is from a game called Journeyman Project Turbo for the PC and Mac. This was composed by Gino Andrews, and we're going to be listening to Science Center, also known as Organic Walls.
Cool. All right, that was Science Center, otherwise known as Organic Walls, from Journeyman Project Turbo. This came out on the PC and Mac in 1994, and then later remade in 2014, I believe, and it was composed by Gino Andrews. This was a game I'd never even heard of until you selected it for the show, so I went out and found the remake and installed it and played it a little bit, and it was really, really cool. I'm curious to know how you came to know this game originally, because it sounds like you had some prior experience with it yourself.
I did. You really downloaded it because I picked it for the show?
Yeah.
Wow. That's so cool.
Well, the music, you were able to get the music out of the game files, so I had to get the game anyway. So I was like, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to install this because it looked really good.
Oh, I see. Another one of these sort of engineering tricks you had to pull
basically,
to make sure we got all the music for this episode.
I love doing that stuff.
That's what I should do from now on. I should be like, I love this game, and it's really hard to get the music. Will Ed have to download it to get it? No, I'm just kidding. Hey, VG Embassy visitors, if you ever want Ed to play a game that you like, get on the show and recommend a track from it and make it really hard for him to get it from the internet. Pro tip.
Yes.
So it's funny that we were just talking about, sweeping synths and things being the sort of standard, because here we are again, back at those sweeping ambient synth sweeps to be light sci-fi. So the Journeyman Project Turbo was actually a CD that came with our first Windows computer that my family ever had. It was a pack-in with Windows 95. And I think you could play through the whole game, but I never got very far because I didn't know what I was doing. But this game just fascinated the crud out of me, and it scared me and just completely pulled me in. So I have plans to actually get it this summer and play through it. I don't know the moment that I got exactly sucked in, but I can tell you that the game itself told me to play the game in a dark room with headphones on, because it was like, there may be stuff in the environment that you need to see that you can't see unless it's dark and it's quiet and stuff. And I never used headphones for computer games at that point. I always played them through the speakers. So when really, to me, scary stuff happened, it was really alarming, because you're in the dark with the headphones on and there's this giant robot that suddenly appears through a door and says, "Out of my way, human, or die." And I was just like, ah. But yeah, so it's, I don't really know how to explain it in terms of the gameplay. I guess I'll explain the story first. The game begins with this really interesting still slideshow with a voiceover describing that it is, what year is it? It's now the year 2318, and some years ago, the Earth went through a major, horrible conflict to end all conflicts, and we basically said, forget it. We're never doing this again. We are learning how to get along. So all of the borders came down, everybody started working together, and we achieved utopia. Then, and I think this is really interesting, they specifically say that after that, Democratic senators, I think, proposed a project to research time travel. And as soon as it was achieved by that group, they disbanded the project because they realized how awful temporal manipulation could be if it fell into the wrong hands. Right. So they moved. So that was called, that project was called Journeyman. So Project Journeyman is time travel. They shut it down. They move it to a secure location that is a secret. It's a secret to everybody, except the people who are still maintaining it. And your character is one of the people working for that secret organization to kind of keep time travel under wraps. It was originally intended in this universe for observational purposes. So the idea to go back to historical time and actually see what really happened, to know what was really the truth or not. But very early on in the game, somebody gets to the time machine and alters history. And so this is happening. In the game, you wake up and you're like going to work. You have to take a transporter to work, and you go to work and everything's fine. And then all these alarm bells start going off in the warehouse or whatever. Yeah. And there's this voice that's like, temporal rip detected. And it explains to you that from the point in history when something is changed, there's like almost like a shock wave that ripples forward that changes everything past that point. And so you have to, and this all happens very early on, so I'm not really ruining everything, but you actually have to, your character decides to escape the shockwave by getting into the time machine and going back in time before it reaches the current moment.
Okay.
So you like jump over it. So you're okay. And there's a hidden disc somewhere in like prehistoric times. I think this is a really interesting concept. The modern day workers on the Journeyman project created like basically a backup of the entire world history and stored it with the dinosaurs.
Oh, neat.
So you go back, you get the disc, and then you bring it back to work after the shockwave has rippled through. You put it in, a computer compares what's different, and then you have to go to those 3 points in history to find out who changed it, why, and to get time back on track.
So I played the remake, so that it's called the Pegasus Project.
Yep.
Which adds some enhanced graphical bells and whistles and makes it run on newer Windows machines, because the original version won't even run on like Windows 7 on up nowadays. They tell you all this like right at the beginning before you even start playing the game.
Oh, interesting.
So the way it introduces it in this full motion video sequence is that, yes, the same thing that happens that you described, where there was this big conflict, the world is at peace, and then these aliens come down and they say, we want you to join us, our Space Federation, and become, your civilization has become advanced enough to join the beings in the stars. And you can become part of this incredible thing. And we're going to come back in 10 years and you're going to give us your answer. I don't know why they took so long to do that. But there was a faction that, kind of very similar to Star Cruiser, there's a faction that was not trustworthy of the aliens and thought that they were going to be dangerous. So they went back in time and created these 3 points in time that would make the human race not trust the aliens, and so they would tell them no when they came back in 10 years. So the purpose of the game is to go correct those 3 parts, like something exploded, somebody got assassinated, et cetera, to make the populace trust the aliens again. So yeah, it's a really, really cool concept. I love sci-fi like that, where you're kind of unmanipulating wrongs that have happened in history. It just seems like a really cool, really well-written sci-fi story, and I can see why it's become or stayed popular. Like in the 10 to 15 years that it's been released, people are still talking about it, posting forums, about their theories about how different things happen and stuff. So it's one of those things that, I wish I had heard of earlier, like when it was still being coming out and people talking about it. But I'm really interested in exploring the game's world now, because it seems like it's very rich and full of lots of really unique concepts for a game.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So that stuff that you were explained about, the aliens asking and the 10-year waiting period, that I think is all uncovered in the original. Like, I think, because you don't know when you start. You just know someone's gone back in time and done these things, and you have to stop the events and then figure out why it's occurring. So I think it's unless I missed something as a kid, it's not, maybe my character doesn't have the clearance to know that information yet, and then you figure it out. But it's so lonely and atmospheric, but it's also really frightening. It's one of those games where you can die in a lot of ways, and it'll give you time to figure out what you need to do. So like the assassination, right? You see the assassination happen if you get to the point at the right time. So you see someone on a catwalk. It's a scientist who gets assassinated. So you see someone on a catwalk shooting. But when you get to that room, they're like poised with their gun, and you have time to like select from your inventory what you're going to use on them and stuff. So I could never figure it out. So I just dreaded those moments where I'm like, how do I stop this? How do I stop this? And then you don't. And then you hear everybody screaming, and then the thing comes up to you and it turns into this robot. And then like, if you don't get out of there, if you don't like abort the mission, you're dead. And the Pegasus thing, you have this like Pegasus chip that will instantly transport you back to the current day. So you can always jump out if you haven't been able to figure it out. So you can always like escape and then go back and try it again. But man, I don't know, just that game really just blew my mind back then. I'd never seen anything like it, and it was so frightening. That whole assassination thing, when you go and you jump to that time, the first thing that happens is you materialize in a science room, which probably is the room with this track, and then like someone shoots you with a dart gun and you like get knocked out, and then you have to synthesize a cure for the poison going through you. Wow. It's like really stressful. But anyway, definitely a mind blower for little baby Key, and I can't wait to actually figure out what the heck I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine the feeling of helplessness, like having the time to be able to solve the problem, but still not knowing how, and just being like, I'm trying everything. What is going on? What combination of things do I need to do? So,
right.
And is it one of those games where it's like not always? I mean, obviously, it's not always obvious if you are having that much trouble figuring out what to do. But I mean, so some of the solutions are not like logical in a sense, because I know like some point in click adventures where it's like you have to combine two ridiculous things to solve a problem that you wouldn't know unless you just kind of combined every single thing that you have in your inventory together.
I don't think it's that. I think I just didn't understand fundamentally how to play, or I came to conclusions that were wrong. Like there's a section where you're in a corridor that gets flooded with poison gas, and I had an oxygen mask, so I thought, I should use that to survive the poison.
That makes sense.
But it doesn't help you survive the poison. And I found out later from watching like a trailer, I just happened to see it, that there's a point in the game where you can jump in water and you need that to breathe. But I think the oxygen is limited. So if you use it up, if you use it up in that poison corridor, you're done. So
Gotcha.
There's kind of I guess the one last thing I'll say about it is there's this really interesting kind of metagaming component to this game, because actually sometimes when you die, you'll get a little description of like, well, you figured this out, kind of. Like I don't want to ruin too much, but there's...
Tells you how close you got to the solution, basically?
Sort of. Like in one of the... I'm sorry, this is so boring, everybody. In one of these instances, there is a space station that has exploded, and you go back in time before the explosion, but you can actually cause the explosion, and there's no way that you would know that you were going to do it. So I did it. And it's just, the screen goes black and you hear this like, ding, and then you see the game over screen. It's like, and it literally says something like, well, you've discovered the reason for the explosion, but you haven't figured out the source. So go ahead and try to figure, so then you like stake out there to see if something appears. So, and I thought that was really cool. So it's one of those games where like death is not necessarily a punishment. Death is almost its own gameplay element to figuring out how you're supposed to proceed.
Right.
So blowing up that space station, while horrifying, is also like, yes, it's like a really cool, like, woohoo, I found something.
That's really
element,
cool.
Even though everyone's dead and you failed.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely looking forward to checking this one out. It looks really cool. All right, so let's go in a completely different direction for the next track.
Let's do it.
What have you got for us next?
Another game I haven't played. This is from a game called Cosmic Spacehead, also known as Linus Spacehead's Cosmic Crusade. This was for the Amiga, DOS, the Game Gear, the Sega Master System, the Genesis, and the NS. What's the NS?
Nintendo Switch?
Really?
Maybe it got re-released for Virtual Console?
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't know. Did I put that there?
I don't know. It's been so long. Hey, everybody. We've been, this episode has been pending.
Oh, you know what? No, it's NES. It's NES. I think it was a typo.
There we go.
Because it did come out on the NES, yeah.
I was like, oh man, what is this system I've never heard of? That's really funny. Yeah, we've been working on this. This episode has been pending. It's been stuck in time travel limbo for a very, very long time. So we may not remember all the reasons for everything.
It wasn't closed in a time loop.
That's right. Yeah, finally Finally, we're going to get to the end of the game. This was composed by Matthew Simmons and Ashley Hogg.
Right, and this is the Amiga version of the track, right?
I believe so.
All right, let's hear it. That was Bumper Car Race from Cosmic Spacehead, otherwise known as Linus Spacehead's Cosmic Crusade. That was the Amiga version of the track, but you can also find this game on DOS, Game Gear, NES, Sega Master System, and the Genesis. They all came out around 1993, and this was composed by Matthew Simmons and Ashley Hogg. This is definitely a Matthew Simmons track. I am familiar with some of his other Amiga works, especially a game called Carve Up, which we played on an old episode of Pixel Tunes Radio when we featured games that were developed by Core. And same instruments, same kind of feel, and that was a Matthew Simmons composition as well. So I'm going to go ahead and say I'm pretty sure that he was also the writer of this particular tune. And a really cool tune, just a nice little bass groove. I mean, this would feel great as the background to almost any kind of action-packed 16 or 8-bit video game single screen kind of a thing, which is exactly what it plays, you know?
Yeah, it's a little mini game, it looks like, of bumper cars racing. Yeah, that bass groove, does he usually go in for the funkiness?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, a lot of funk, a lot of like really kind of like jazz fusion kind of tracks, very upbeat and very happy sounding. So he also did a lot of the demo scene. We've played his stuff on Impulse Project as well. He went by the name Format.
Excellent.
Which was a clever play on his first name. So have you ever, you said you didn't play this game, right?
Nope, this was just another random find. And I kind of wanted to, it's funny, we had a conversation about this at the time because I was like, I wasn't sure if I should include this one because it's very cartoony and very silly and kind of comedy-esque. And for some reason, I wasn't sure if that fit with light sci-fi. Of course it does.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Jetsons version of sci-fi.
Yeah, oh, actually, that's great. That's a really great way of putting it. Totally. Or like Toe Jam and Earl kind of sci-fi. You know, it's very kind of just
cartoony,
quirky and cute. And, we're not looking at any serious themes necessarily. But let me give you a rundown of what the game is actually about. So it's funny that I mentioned Toe Jam and Earl because the character Linus is actually an alien from the planet Linoleum who has crashed on Earth, which has some kind of legendary status in the galaxy, probably as a very wacky place to be. And so he goes home, and everyone receives him with a hero's welcome. And there are folks on Linoleum, however, who are skeptical that Earth exists. So I guess the game is about your going back to Earth and taking pictures with a camera so you can go back home and prove that, yes, this is actually true. I'm not just making up all this wacky stuff about this random planet. And it's it looks like a point and click, but with platforming elements. So I guess there's some puzzle solving in between platforming segments, and then you actually have to, bust out the platforming skills to get through little segments.
Yeah, I played the Amiga version a little bit over the weekend, and you're right. So there's point and click screens, and then you walk off the edge of the screen, and then you're in this little platforming section. And from what I can tell, or at least what I played, you don't have any sort of weapon or any way to attack the enemies that are on the screen. You just have to jump and avoid anything that's walking around. It's very simple platforming. You collect these little candies, and as soon as you collect a certain number of candies, you get an extra life. and you die in one hit, whether you fall off the stage or whether you get touched by an enemy. Once you clear that side-scrolling action segment, you go to another point-and-click screen, and after you clear it, you no longer have to play that segment over again. So once you do that, then when you move between point-and-click areas, you just see like an overview, like a zoomed-out map, and your character just kind of moves as an icon from one area of the map to another.
That's cool.
So it's kind of like almost like fast traveling, like in like Fallout 3 or something like that. Once you get to one place, you can then just zip there instead of having to worry about taking the long way around.
Right.
And the point and click was fun. I mean, it wasn't anything special. It was just collecting items, talking to people, and finding out what items they need to give you what you need. You know, it was very kind of basic point and click kind of stuff. But the writing was funny. Had very kind of a British sense of humor. Graphics were very, very simple, very 16-bit style graphics. Even for the Amiga, they were very simple. And the music was good. I mean, it's Matt Simmons. He's a great composer. This is one of his earlier works, so it wasn't a lot of the complex, like, proggy stuff that he got into later on. But I had fun with it. I played it a lot longer than I originally intended to, which is always the mark of a good playable game.
I was gonna say it's a good sign.
Yeah,
it's a good sign.
So yeah, it was cool. And again, definitely light sci-fi. It was very humorous. There's no extreme danger or like you said with the plot, you're just trying to prove that Earth exists. It's not like there's some enemy that's trying to take over the world or anything. You're just trying to get people to believe what you experienced on your previous game's adventure. So it's pretty cool.
Space tourism, essentially. So I really love that you brought up the Jetsons, because a lot of these games that we're talking about, they're not grounded in those cartoon sensibilities, right? So now I'm thinking about specifically sci-fi cartoons. And so I'm thinking, now I haven't watched Futurama. I'm assuming you have.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. Would that qualify as dark sci-fi, even though it's cartoony and kind of, irreverent and silly? Because I'm trying to think if there's a cartoon, if there's a humorous dark sci-fi cartoon.
It kind of skirts the line. I mean,
it like pulls back the curtain every so often, like, oh, that's terrible.
It's very meta. It's very satire. I wouldn't necessarily put it in dark, because there's always kind of the good guys always win. I would be curious as to what the listeners who have more experience with it would place it in light or dark, but I have a feeling that some people would place it in dark and some people would place it in light. From what I've seen of it, which is probably a couple seasons worth out of the whole body of work, I've always felt like there were more elements of light than anything. Like, it kind of presents the world as a little dingy and a little broken down, but livable, and you're able to have a good life without feeling like you're in danger all the time, which is what dark sci-fi, like there's always somebody lurking around the corner ready to kill you, and I never really got that feeling from the Futurama universe,
Yeah, that's interesting, because I'm wondering, I'm just sitting here wondering specifically, when you mix in the variable of humor, does that lighten the dark sci-fi? Like, will that always bring it out? Does it have to be serious? And while you were talking about like your breakdown of dark sci-fi just now, I was thinking, the Sonic the Hedgehog Saturday morning cartoon was absolutely, I would say, dark sci-fi, because you've got technology ruining the planet, people being captured and turned into robots, and you've got the freedom fighters, Sonic and the gang, trying to overthrow a tyrannical regime. Yeah, man, I love that stuff. I wish there'd been more cartoons like that when I was growing up. I really loved the super serious, like, stuff's really on the line, you're gonna cry because so-and-so's relatives have gotten taken away, that kind of thing. But yeah, so I guess it exists, but that show, even the Sonic the Hedgehog Saturday morning cartoon had comedic elements, but I would not consider it a comedy. So, but then there was the other Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon, which was just sort of laughy-jokey and definitely not dark sci-fi, even though it's basically the same story.
Right. And they also have a lot of fantasy elements, too, talking anthropomorphic animals and a lot of magical, quote-unquote, stuff and, things that wouldn't exist in the real world. And then there's shows like Rick and Morty, which are interdimensional travel, but that's extremely satirical and almost kind of cynical. I think maybe that would fit more in the dark sci-fi, at least more than Futurama. Because there's a lot of really dark stuff in Rick and Morty that they take very lightly, like very dark humor. And I think that would probably, just based on the fact that it's always, like I said, a lot more cynical and a lot more sarcastic, I think Rick and Morty would be more of a example of a dark sci-fi cartoon than anything else. But again,
we're coming up with subgenres.
Yeah,
Darker
it's
sci-fi.
interesting. Again, I'm not a huge Rick and Morty fan either, so I'd be interested to hear what people have to say. You know, I know there's a lot of really diehard fans out there, so where that would fit in the
shady
whole
sci-fi,
shady sci-fi,
darkish sci-fi,
gray.
This is
sci-fi.
actually this is reminding me of an argument that I get into with my husband all the time, which I think is really funny. I love to have this argument where I will say to him, I could look at a show or a movie or a video game that is like totally on the surface fantasy, but if somebody comes in and says, actually, that exists because this science thing happened before, I'm like, that's sci-fi. He's like, it is not. It has dragons. And I'm like, but the dragons were genetically created by people in ancient history. He's like, no, this is fantasy, Emily. It's dragons.
Interesting.
So, but I think that's funny because that's, I cut actually a track from this episode. I was going to play something from Phantasy Star 3. And I was going to bring up the concept of, there's sort of like this genre of sci-fi, which is, you're in a fantasy setting, but it's fantasy that's post a sci-fi world. So like sci-fi has happened, and then either the people rebelled against it and they've gone back to a more natural way of life, or it's been so long that they've forgotten all of that. And I've read a bunch of the Dragon Riders of Pern novels, and that takes place in a post. They're on a planet that once had technology, but they don't know how it was done.
Okay.
So when they come across ancient ruins, they will marvel over how like a perfect arch was somehow carved through solid rock. Like what could have existed that could have done that?
Yeah.
And Nathaniel's like, that's fantasy. And I'm like, no, it's not. So there is, I mean, obviously the answer is both are correct depending on your point of view, but I really like to just be like, nope.
Even the Legend of Zelda universe, like the Hylians were this technological race that died off eons ago, and now the people of Hyrule are living in this world that is kind of like dotted with all of this kind of weird high-tech stuff that they only have a very rudimentary knowledge, especially Breath of the Wild, where you go into these shrines that are, you know, very technological, and you kind of go in and out of these into the fantasy world.
That's really cool. I didn't know there was a tech component really.
Yeah,
to the history of Hyrule.
For sure, the Hylians
Ooh.
were this ancient race that really had a lot of like futuristic stuff going on, and especially Breath of the Wild, where you get this tablet that acts like, you know, an iPad that you carry around with you on your journey. But then you're out there with a sword or a stick, just kind of like poking Octoroks and stuff. So it's a real kind of anachronistic, you know, you've got this future tech, but you don't have futuristic weapons to combine with it, you know, so it's really, really cool.
Suddenly Link riding a motorcycle is making a lot more sense.
Yes.
I have not played Breath of the Wild, so to me, I was like, what? But that's really interesting because I always thought from the Zelda games I've played, it always seemed grounded in magic. It was all about the sages and stuff. So maybe eventually they kind of reveal the sages as being technologically advanced, and that's how they do their magic.
They focused a lot on the fantasy in the earlier games, but the later ones, like starting I think with like Twilight Princess, they really started to get a little bit more of this tech stuff kind of creeping in to the world. And it would be really interesting to see a future Zelda game where things are... I don't know if they would do that because they would be afraid of what the fans would think, but to see a Zelda game where they're like really like maybe transported back to the prime of the Hylian, you know, universe, where things are really, really futuristic and like maybe it doesn't have guns or anything, but maybe a laser sword or, you know, something cool like that, just to bring it out of its fantasy roots a little bit. But that's just the sci-fi fanboy me talking.
And then they should go extreme and everyone should be swearing and smoking
cigarettes,
and there will be, you know, a lot of bars ever. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool.
Link somehow has an eye patch for no particular reason and gray hair.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I've not played Twilight Princess. I have it, and I want to.
Yeah, great game.
So that's really intriguing to me that I did not know that. Ooh, thank you. Thank you for teaching me things this episode.
Should be fun. All right, so speaking of things that we're going to teach each other, the next game is a game I have no experience with whatsoever.
Oh my gosh, I love this game. And this is a prime example of, is this light sci-fi? I really shoehorned this in here. So we're going to talk about all of that and have the debate after. This is from the game XCOM 2. And this came out for Linux, Macintosh, PlayStation 4, Windows, Xbox One. The track was composed by Tim Wynn, and the track is Squad Loadout.
Alright, that was Squad Loadout from XCOM 2, the Linux, Mac, PS4, Windows, and Xbox One game released in 2016, composed by Mr. Tim Wynn. And that was a win for me, anyway. Great track, very bombastic, very heroic. I feel like this is a track that would play when you're about ready to head out into battle to get you excited to go kill some alien scum.
Yep, you nailed it.
I'm assuming by the name Squad Loadout that it plays right before a battle begins. So
you nailed it.
Yeah, it's nice. It's got a very symphonic feel, but then there's a little kind of a chuggy industrial style guitar thing going on, like very, very faintly in the background to give you that kind of like hint of danger or sci-fi-ness going on. Some really bombastic like timpani drums. I really like this one. I'm not a huge fan of symphonic music, but this one had enough oomph and kind of a modern feel to get me going.
Oh, excellent. I'm glad it passed the test. I was also very excited to find out that Tim Wynn did the music to Supernatural, which is like your jam.
Yeah, that's really cool. He must have done a lot of the like the incidental music and stuff. Most of the music from Supernatural is very like southern guitar rock.
Huh.
So if he did a lot of that stuff, that would mean he's a pretty versatile composer. It's really cool.
That is very interesting. All right, so XCOM 2. Is it light sci-fi? I actually asked my husband this, and he said, no, absolutely not. This is dark sci-fi. And I said, but I really want it to be light sci-fi. So I kind of think that perhaps this track aesthetically is light sci-fi. I really wanted to include it because I really felt like if we're talking about light sci-fi and we're talking about military themes, you gotta have something with French horns in it. And nothing I picked had the horns in it. But this has
kind of like the air raid sirens for the dark sci-fi. It's like you need at least one track with air raid sirens for dark sci-fi.
Right.
Something with French horns for light sci-fi.
Exactly. And that stuff exists, in the Mass Effect tracks, but I just didn't pick one that would have brought that out. So here's the thing with XCOM 2. The story of XCOM 2 is that a military organization on Earth has lost a war with aliens prior to the game. So now Earth is under this kind of totalitarian regime, but it's being peddled as a utopia.
Okay.
So humans are kind of told what to do, and they're kept under very strict control.
So more of a Big Brother is watching kind of an environment.
Kind of, yeah. And so you are the commander of troops of a rebel organization that the first mission that you go on is an act of terror, essentially. You in a very symbolic show, you blow up a giant statue of one of the propaganda alien structures that has been erected somewhere. I mean, I think really the plot is extremely dark sci-fi, and especially as it goes forward, you find out all these horrible things that are being done behind the scenes to people and things like that. But I think aesthetically it feels very light sci-fi. So I really feel like this one is on the fence, depending on whether you're going to put more stock in aesthetics and music or if you're going to put more stock in the backstory. But aesthetically, even though you are kind of a ragtag organization that's trying to fight back against this regime, your squad armor still looks great. You develop a whole lot of tech that looks really shiny and cool. You've got laser guns eventually, So yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like I feel guilty putting this one in there, but I love it so much. And I do feel like even though the game has these gritty story elements and gritty cutscenes and things, the gameplay as a whole doesn't feel very gritty to me. It feels very polished, even though you will literally be going into decimated camps where everything's on fire and trying to shoot aliens to save civilians and things like that.
I guess, the kind of sci-fi a world could also change depending on whose perspective you're seeing it from. So the regime might be telling everybody, hey, this is a light sci-fi world, Everything is a utopia. Everything is cool. But the rebels are like, no, man, this is dark sci-fi. You're oppressing us and we need to, Right. It's like if you watch Fox News all the time, you think we're living in a utopia right now. If you read Huffington Post, maybe you're going to think we're in a dark sci-fi world right now. So right. It's an interesting way to look at it. So I can probably spin that in a way to make this a light sci-fi game and allow it in the show. Not that I would disallow it anyway, but...
Right. Well, let's say this. I guess it's interesting because I would say that the game story, like I've been saying, is dark sci-fi, but the alien regime is trying so hard, like you're saying, to put the spin on it that it's light sci-fi, that does it become light sci-fi in that? It doesn't. But you know what I'm saying? It's just funny that I picked a game where the point of the game is that they are trying to convince you that this is a utopia to cover up all these horrible things, and that even in practice when you're going through the game, it looks utopian-ish. But really, I picked it for the French horns.
Kind of reminds me also of the Portal games, Because at Portal, you start off, you're just doing these tests.
Great example.
You're like, hey, this is a very lighthearted sci-fi game. And then you literally peek behind the scenes and see all the dark sci-fi stuff and understand what's going on. And yeah, so that's really cool. That's
a great example because Portal 1 to me, I think of as being very light sci-fi because it feels that way. And we had this discussion. Did we have this on the air? Or did we just have this personally? We were debating whether or not Portal was light or dark sci-fi, and we actually you looked up playthroughs to see how long the average player would spend.
That's right, I remember that.
Each side of it, because you were like, well, if you spend more time in the section where the veneer has been ripped away, then maybe it's dark sci-fi. But if you spend time in the part where everything looks glossy and fine, then maybe it's... So like I said, this whole light sci-fi thing is a very fluid category, so it might really depend kind of subjectively on how what parts somebody kind of clings to when they experience the game.
But even so, I mean, looking back on it now, I don't remember what my reasoning was when we discussed that originally, but even if you spend 99% of the game in a light sci-fi world, so to speak, and the last 1%, the last final boss...
Right.
The veneer finally gets ripped away.
Right.
that means that your light sci-fi was fake the entire time anyway.
Right,
so
right.
that would immediately like just shove everything into the dark sci-fi category, in my opinion,
Right.
anyways. So if it's light sci-fi and it's not real, then it's not light sci-fi. You know,
Yeah.
if at any point you are realizing that you are being tricked by somebody that's manipulating your viewpoint on the world, then immediately you're just right back into the dark sci-fi mode. So
Yeah, that is very, very interesting. And that also kind of makes me think about, how much does the creator's intent factor into this? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Because the Portal game is really built, the whole game builds towards that realization. So that's really what the whole game is about, is getting to that, that climax.
Just building this character that's talking to you the entire time, and are they good? Are they bad? Are they good? And
right, yeah.
the truth comes out.
Yeah. Anyway, I do love the game XCOM 2 a lot. It's the only XCOM I've played. I should say, so we're talking about how great the music is, and one thing I want to say about this game that I've said before, the sound design on this game is so good. Oh, by the way, I spent a lot of time listening to this track too, because this is the track that plays while you are gearing up your soldiers. And this game is so hard that really you have to really pay attention to what you're equipping on all of your soldiers each time you go into battle. So you'll spend a lot of time listening to this and trying to decide who's going to have which gun and what upgrades and blah, blah, blah. And which soldiers you're going to use because they can get taken out of combat, etc. This is a turn-based tactical strategy game. But I don't know if we said it on air during the break, but we were like talking about how this track really pumps you up to go out into battle. And it really does. I mean, every time I decide to go on a mission and it just starts with that wugga-dugga-dun-dugga, I'm like, yes! and every time, I mean, it never gets old to me. Every time I get really excited. But even the sound effects are just amazing. For somebody who loves just sound effects and distinct ear feel, oh my gosh. Your character's running and hearing like the little subtle clickety-clack of the zippers on their suits, or like every gun has a distinct sound, and even certain things that'll happen, like sort of game events that will trigger. There's this thing called Overwatch. You can basically tell a soldier, stay put and don't do anything unless an enemy crosses your line of fire, and if they cross your line of fire, fire. Mm-hmm. When you're playing the game, you don't necessarily know where the enemy groups are because you can only see so far around you. So a lot of the strategy is about hiding and making sure that you place your characters well so that if on the enemy turn, if they walk into you, they won't see you, and then trigger an encounter because then they'll get the first shot. Right. When you trigger Overwatch, there's this noise. It's like when you take a drumstick and you drag it on a cymbal and it goes shwa, like that. Do you know what I'm saying? So that noise happens, and then the camera like spins around behind your Overwatch character who's now coming out to shoot, and everything slows down into slow motion. Oh my gosh. Even just thinking about it right now, it's so good. All the people who designed what sound effects happened when and exactly how they would play out. Overwatch triggering is one of the most satisfying experiences I've ever had in a video game. It's just so good. Overall, so good.
That's cool.
Yeah, if you like a game that's going to use its sound and its music well to heighten your experience with the game, this is one of them, for sure.
Excellent. I played Mario plus Rabbids, which from what I hear...
I'm sorry. We just go from XCOM to... Yeah, I played Mario and Rabbids. That's really fun. Okay, go ahead.
Well, it's supposed to be an XCOM, basically XCOM for kids. It's a turn-based. It plays exactly the same way. And you talking about the Overwatch reminded me that they have an ability, like Mario and Luigi have this ability where you can set them to, if an enemy crosses the path, they will jump out from wherever they are, things slow down, and then they will fire.
Oh, that's so funny.
Like
I gotta watch gameplay
or throw
of
a
this.
hammer. Yeah, so it's there's a lot of extremely common scenarios and similarities between the two games, but in a very, very different environment. So yeah, I would love to hear what you think about the video based on what you know about XCOM and XCOM 2. Because they're supposed to be based on, very similar gameplay engines, just very different styles. That is absolutely hilarious. Yeah.
That is so funny.
So, we're moving on to a game that has nothing at all in common with XCOM, from what I know of. Anyway, what do we got coming up, Emily?
We have Destination Earthstar for the NES, also something I've never played. Composed by Mark Van Heck, we're going to be listening to Base Attack.
Ooh, Mark Van Heck. This is the first time we're ever playing him unironically. Let's take a listen.
Oh, really? Yeah. You'll have to explain that later.
Mm-hmm. And that was Bass Attack from Destination Earthstar from the NES, which came out in 1990, composed by Mr. Mark Van Heck. So, you want to hear the story of Mark Van Heck?
Please.
Okay, so I mentioned that this is the first time we're playing him unironically. This is a story that goes back to the earlier days of Pixel Tunes Radio. And we got our first mention on another podcast as kind of like a little bump from some of the guys from the Retro Junkies Network.
Oh, cool.
Which is no longer around, but they were really good guys. And they said that one of their favorite episodes of Pixel Tunes that they'd listened to was our Marvel Comics video game episode, which was really funny because we had never done one of them. So we were talking about this with my friend Aaron, who was on episode 14 of the VG Embassy, our Flip the Cube blind listen, and we had a little bit later on a listener tracks episode where people can, like VGM Jukebox, come in with their testimonials and request tracks for us. And so Aaron submitted one as a voice testimonial. And kind of ribbing off of that Marvel Comics thing, he was like, yeah, guys, I love your show, especially your episode that you did spotlighting composer Mark Van Heck.
Oh,
and of course, we had never done one before. So that kind of became the Pixel Tunes in-joke with Aaron about our lovely Mark Van Heck episode and blah, 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 blah. So since then, he's been kind of our, like, mascot kind of satire composer.
Yeah, that's cute.
So whenever we play a track from him, it's usually kind of a like a satire thing. And I don't think we've had anybody select a track from Mark Van Heck that hasn't been because it's been a less than stellar track. Mm-hmm. If you can read between the lines there. So,
right.
So like I said, this is the first time it's been picked unironically, and yeah, I believe it. This is one of his better tracks. It's got a very coherent kind of melody. It's a little bit dissonant and sounds a little bit janky, but I do actually like that about this track. It feels like it's almost intentional, rather than some of his other tracks, which sound very kind of like pieced together, or he didn't have enough time to finish his project kind of a thing. And I'm assuming that's probably, close to a reason why you picked this one out of the soundtrack as well.
Well, in fact, I believe there are only 2 tracks on this entire soundtrack.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, but I did actually really like this one. I thought this was neat. I think it really kind of captured that out in space frontier feeling. I love that the triangle wave is the one carrying the melody, because I think that sounds very space-ish.
Yeah, that's not a normal thing for the NES at all.
Yeah, it's a very interesting decision.
It reminds me a lot of the Maniac Mansion soundtrack, especially with that triangle lead. It's the same instrument, and it has that very kind of like American feel, because he's one of the few American NES composers, and they seem to, I don't know, share the same sound driver or the same instrument sets amongst one another, because they always seem to use the same instruments when they're making music, even if they're across developers or different publishers. It's got that very kind of quintessential American NES sound to it, which is very cool.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so this game, I think, is pretty solidly in light sci-fi territory, and I thought the story was really neat. So apparently the backstory of this game is that we're in the future at some point, and 200 years prior, some Earthlings were captured as slaves, basically, by an alien race.
Dark sci-fi.
Yes, right. So we have to go through the dark to get to the light. So
exactly.
the captured Earthlings eventually are freed and quote-unquote earn the privilege to live amongst the aliens as equals. So now we've got a joint society of respect. And the descendants of those captured Earthlings decide to, or at least some of them, decide to get in a ship and go back to try to find Earth to see what's up with where they came from.
That's the name of the game.
And I just think that's a really cool concept, you know, to remove a species of people to the point where they can't contact, you know, where they came from. And then so long after, the descendants deciding to go back and return. I think it's a really cool concept. I think it has happened in our history, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Where folks have been taken, enslaved, transported with no way of getting back home or communicating with anybody. And then later, you know, as things get more globalized, descendants being able to do that. So definitely mirroring a real world situation, but in a different way that seems less awful and sad. Somehow this story seems, I don't know, hopeful to me, as opposed to fixating on the horrific wrongs that were done to get us to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we had caught up with these Earthlings earlier in their history, this would have been a very different dark sci-fi kind of game.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm assuming if you beat this game, you probably end up finding Earth and finding it inhabitable and making a new colony for yourself or whatever. And that's like the epitome of light sci-fi, right? Because you are beginning life anew and, you know, you have your old planet back. And
well, it's interesting that you say that because, you know, you just said 99% of it can be light and then the last 1% can knock it solidly into dark sci-fi. I purposely did not look to see what happens at the end of the game. So I don't know what happens when you get to Earth.
It could be a completely desolate, used up planet for all we know.
Right, or it's like debris or something, and it's like, oh. So I don't know if going back to Earth and finding debris would be necessarily dark sci-fi. I think that would just be a sad ending. But I'm trying to think how in the last 1% you could turn this into a dark sci-fi story without being like, oh, haha, this is all a simulation, and actually you're still enslaved, but, you know.
Yeah. Or they could find the planet completely inhospitable or overrun with crazy mutants that are, you know, out to eat whatever lands on the planet.
Or maybe they find out they were never Earthlings at all. That's how you make it dark sci-fi. They go back and they find out that they weren't Earthlings at all, that they were just like the other aliens, but had just been enslaved for arbitrary reasons.
Interesting.
And then it's like, oh, our whole society is a lie. Like all that respect that we earned. Yeah, exactly. We were told that we had to earn their respect and become a part of their society when really we should have been all along. Roll credits.
Oh, man. That's a Black Mirror twist right there, or a Twilight Zone twist right there. Call up M. Night Shyamalan. Give him the plot. We'll make millions.
No, don't do that. Call somebody else.
This is one of those games that I never really... It was always like on the rental shelves at
so you've seen it in the wild.
Yeah. But it always... I don't know. It's like I was always very aware of what publishers made really good games, and I was not familiar with the company that made this one, and it always had a very kind of thrown together, very simple graphics look to it, so I didn't really pay much attention to it. I was always after, like, what did Konami make, or what did Capcom make? So I never really got a chance to check this one out. But now knowing the plot, because I hadn't even known the plot until now, I might want to check it out and see. Probably a pretty quick game to play. I imagine you could probably get it done in an afternoon or something, so I'll check it out sometime.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the story is cool, but I think, like you were saying earlier, it's a backdrop for the gameplay, so I don't really know how much that's going to translate into the experience.
Well, it better not be a long game, because like you said, there's only 2 musical tracks.
Oh, I know.
So
when I pulled it up, I was like, wait a minute. And I dug around to make sure that there wasn't something wrong with the files that I had. I was like, 2? Really? Just 2? That seemed so unusual to me. So yeah, kind of a yellow flag on the play.
I'm not sure I could handle like a 3-hour game with this as the only background music to the gameplay. So I'm really curious about your next game and how this fits into light sci-fi, because I know vaguely about the plot and the type of game it is. And I don't know, I want to hear you talk about it a little bit. So what do we got next?
Okay, this is a total, what's the word I want to use? I don't know. I feel like we're veering off into a completely different direction of anything that we've been listening to so far in terms of the game. Not necessarily the music, but yeah, kind of the music too. This is from a game called Emit Volume 1, Toki no Maigo. This was for the Saturn. This track was composed by Tetsuya Komuro and Yoshiyuki Ito, and a very special thanks to Electric Boogaloo for finding those composers. And this is Chapter 5.
All right, let's take a listen. That's right. That was Chapter 5 from Emit Volume 1, Toki no Maigo. Came out on the Saturn, only in Japan, in 1995, composed by Tetsuya Komuro and Yoshiyuki Ito. And again, thank you to Electric Boogaloo for coming up with those composers for us. We appreciate it. I think those guys were definitely channeling Yuzo Koshiro and Streets of Rage when they wrote this particular track.
We both had that reaction.
They did a very good job of it as well. It's a little on the slower side than a lot of the Streets of Rage stuff, but it's got some really, really cool vocal samples and some really cool like lead note runs. I really like this one a lot.
Now you picked this one.
I did. There's a lot of music in this game. So this game has 3 different volumes. And each of the volumes has, I'm going to say like 80% of the soundtrack is the same between the volumes. But but then there are some different pieces of music in between, and I think this one appears on all three of the volumes. It's a game that tries to help you learn English for native Japanese speakers, and it does so in a kind of a visual novel type setting, right? I'm not sure how much if you've played this or if you've watched a video walkthrough or...
That's right. In fact, Ed, jam the mic, rock the disco. Yeah, so this game was developed as an educational title to help Japanese students learn English. So you will go through it visual novel style, like you were saying. There's a narrator who sort of explains what's happening to the character as she engages with dialogue and things with other characters. And then after each chapter, you actually, take a comprehension test. So I watched a scene where the main character is having a conversation with somebody on a street corner, and, they say things like, the guy says to her, excuse me, may I ask something, miss? What is the date today? What month and what day are we in, may I ask? And then she repeats like, what date and what month? So they're trying to hit all these sort of keywords.
It's very simple, and
then she says, vocabulary. It's Wednesday, October 5th, 1994. And then something I think is really funny is the character she's speaking to does what I think of as a very anime thing, where he looks off into the sky and he says to himself, it's 1994, isn't it? And I just thought that was really funny because he should be saying like, so it's 1994, is it? But they put isn't it, which I think is funny. But anyway.
Right.
But yeah, so then after that, you'll take a comprehension test and it'll be like, what day was it? What was the date, or what did the guy ask about? And you have to answer. But it involves time travel somehow. So, I just thought that this was really interesting to find a language learning game like this. And I just really wanted to put it in. So for me, it's light sci-fi because it's a kind of a lighthearted romp through the time travel element. But I was just so intrigued by this language learning component, like watching the family sit down to dinner and have a very stilted conversation about what they did at school or what they're eating or something. And it's so fun to watch as someone who can speak English to see like, what did they think was important to teach? In the scene I was just talking about on the street corner, the man specifically asks for a watchmaker's. He wants to go to a watchmaker's. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm like, we would never say that here, but I'm sure they would over there, that they would have, a watchmaker's shop and they would say it that way. Whereas we would go to like a jeweler's to get our watch, or at least I did growing up. But anyway, so that's kind of fun. It's fun to see your culture filtered through another culture trying to teach another culture about you, but still set it in Japan.
Yeah, and the dialogue always comes off as really stilted and really repetitive because they're obviously trying to repeat these words over and over again in different usages to get you used to what word means what.
Right.
So it comes off more amusing to us. I don't know how a Japanese native speaker would have viewed it when they were playing the game, but yeah, it's cool. They kind of inadvertently made a Japanese only game, which is completely playable,
right?
For North Americans and Europeans. So it's neat to kind of. I watched a little bit of it. I made a copy of it, the original one, playing my Saturn, and was kind of going through it a little bit, and I was having fun. I was just chuckling to myself. It's just an interesting little visual novel. I didn't get to. I probably played just as much as you watched, where the guy came up to the girl on the street, and she's like, "Why would he be talking to me?
Right.
I'm just a high school girl.
Right.
Like I don't have any why would a man talk to me?" It was like just really kind of interesting.
Yes, the narrator specifically says that she can't believe that a man as old as him would speak so politely to her.
Yes,
I thought that was really interesting. Yeah,
because that's a very cultural Japanese thing. Yeah,
I would love to play this game.
It's interesting. I wanna get through all three volumes. There's a lot of games in this show that we're doing that I really want to check out that hit all those like sci-fi check boxes for me. And this one's just more of a cultural curiosity, I think, than even the sci-fi.
Yeah, I think
element.
so.
I don't exactly know like how the time travel element fits in. I know that the stranger that sees her, that talks to her on the street, is from a different time,
right.
But I don't know when and where that kind of all fits into the whole thing.
Right.
But
neither do I.
I don't think that this goes into a dark sci-fi area at all. Just from the look and the feel and the music, it seems to be a very light, like, Sailor Moon style.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of an anime series.
Exactly. And I love this track so much. I can't wait to listen to the rest of this soundtrack.
Yeah, it's really dancey. This one I picked because of its danciness and its similarity to Streets of Rage. The rest of the soundtrack is a little less dancey and a little more traditional VGM, but it's all really good stuff and definitely worth listening to.
And it's interesting to bring up Streets of Rage because I know that I saw an interview with Yuzo Koshiro, and I think it was in the Diggin' in the Carts series, but I can't remember. But somebody, he specifically said that he had Americans saying to him, like, I love your music. It was such an influence on me. And he always thought that was really funny because he was like, well, it's your music. I listened to it and copied it. Not copied it, but that he specifically was trying to emulate what was American club music at the time.
Yeah.
And for him to have Americans come up to him and say, wow, your stuff influenced me so much was so interesting to him. So yeah, I mean, I really think that this track was perhaps also trying to channel what back then would have been a very distinctly American feel. The CNC Music Factory.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. Like
Yeah.
1995, this was only a couple years after Streets of Rage 2 and 3 came out, so they were still very contemporary music for its time, for sure.
Right, exactly.
All right, want to move on to our next one?
Let's do it. All right, next. Okay, I'm so excited about this one. I'm so excited. Did you listen to this one ahead of time?
Just a tiny little bit.
Oh boy, okay. This is from a game called FTL, Faster Than Light. This was a game for the browsers, the iPads, the Linuxes, the Macintoshes, the Windows. And it was composed by Ben Prunty, or Prunty, I'm actually not sure. I'm going to say Prunty. And we're going to be listening to the track Last Stand.
That was Last Stand from Faster Than Light, which came out for browsers, iPads, Linuxes, Macintoshes, Windowses. Released in 2012's, composed by the Ben Prunties. That was great. I'm like, my brain is just going a million miles a minute right now because that's like the percussion that just plays in my head when I'm in a good mood and walking down hallways and streets, and stompy Blue Man Group style trash can lids on brick walls, and just really kind of complex and in time with very simple synths. Like, that just has all the sounds that I love about like industrial and synthwave music all rolled into one. So really, really good feels from this one.
Oh, excellent. I'm so glad you liked it. I was so excited at the top of the show when you said you hadn't listened to them all ahead of time. I was like, oh, I hope he hasn't listened to this one. I want to hear his reaction in real time. Yeah. Oh, man. So, I love this track, and all of the music in this game is super amazing, but I specifically picked this one not only because it's a boss theme, it just happens to be boss theme, but my husband has been playing a lot of this game lately, and I always want him to have it playing out loud when I'm like reading a book or something, because I just love listening to it. And no matter what I am doing, when this track comes on and it hits, there's a change at about the 3-minute mark, and like more drums come in and like a heavier beat comes in. No matter what I am doing, when this track comes on, I will stop and I'll be like, hey, what are you doing over there? And I'll like go and look at the screen. And when I say that, I mean, I don't actually consciously realize that it's the final battle or necessarily what I've heard. It's just that there's something about this track that like grabs my brain and pulls me out of whatever I'm doing. And I'm like, oh, hey, you're on the final battle again. So I think that's really cool that so many times this track has caught my ear before I even realized what was happening, that it that powerfully pulls me, hooks me in its direction.
Yeah, the percussion is just so unique sounding. I can see how it would pull me in the same way I think it would pull you. I would want to see what's being represented on screen with music like this. Like, I would feel like whatever I would like go to be looking at would be really, really cool, just because the music just sounds like it's indicative of something that's very epic and very kind of unique looking.
Yes.
And it's great. It's got kind of an 80s aesthetic, but then it also feels very futuristic and a little bit tribal and a little bit of all sorts of things mooshed into one. It feels very dark sci-fi to me, though, especially when those drum loops come in that are a little bit like 8-bit and gritty sounding.
Yeah,
like
that really crunchy.
Yeah, exactly. So just based on the music alone, I would consider this like a darker sci-fi game. But I mean, I don't know much about it. I know that my friend Todd is a huge fan of the soundtrack and of the game, but he hasn't told me too much. So like, how does this fit into the light sci-fi motif?
Okay, so to me, I guess I'll explain the gameplay a little bit first. This game is kind of like, it reminds me of Sim Tower, sort of. You have a ship, and you control the crew on the ship, and it's a top-down view, and the ship has different designated rooms, and the little characters that walk around kind of look like the aerial views of the little bases loaded guys. It's just like a head on a blob with like little circles for hands, and so you'll see them just like tapping away at a keyboard or something. It's really cute, actually. But so as you play through the game, you will actually designate the rooms for specific functions. Like, you can build one to be a med bay, you can build one to be your weapons room and stuff, and depending on where you put it in the ship and how many characters you put in that room, that will affect the power that you get to that system, basically. Okay. And you battle with other ships in real time. So, you know, you're firing at them, they're firing at you. So let's say they fire a missile and it like punctures your med bay, then you've lost your med bay capabilities until you send your characters in to like fix it. So the more characters that are in there trying to fix it, the faster it'll get fixed. But maybe they breached the hull in there, so the oxygen is running out, so your characters will lose health while they're trying to fix the hull. So it's that kind of thing. There's a lot of and you can pause it and like click on each individual character or groups of them and say, you guys go here and here and here and here, and then when you unpause, everyone will go and do their thing. But it looks very stressful. I'm gonna play it eventually, but I love watching my husband play it. It's just so much fun. And there are different races and everything, and you go through different sectors of space, and there's backstory to the different races, kind of, and all the different sectors of space have different themes. So like the different species have their own theme, and then when you're in battle in that system, it's the same theme but with drums, and it's cool. It's like really neat.
Cool. Yeah.
So in terms of why it's light sci-fi, the story of the game is that you have critical information that you need to deliver to an ally before like the bad guy fleet gets to the base. So you have to make your way through space and build up your ship enough so that when you arrive at the final base, you can protect it from the onslaught, essentially. Okay. So to me, it feels light sci-fi primarily because you're in space the whole time. So it's got that very empty, lonely space thing going on. Mm-hmm. Plus, very clear good guy, bad guy, at least from your perspective. And you are kind of defending from an attack. Yeah. But you're right that this track does sound super dark sci-fi, super dark sci-fi. And something that I think is really awesome about this track is that, so, I've described the gameplay, and these battles, especially the final ones, can go on for a very long time where you're just like trying to ping away depending on what you've built up on your ship and what their defenses are and all that. I love how this track has this like constant serious tension to it without overwhelming you, because the gameplay itself is really overwhelming and you have to concentrate and you have to be keeping track of like 10 different things at any given time. So the fact that they could build a track that is so obviously a final boss track that has so much presence and atmosphere, but is not like, completely wailing on the guitars or drawing your... It's good backdrop music, but you can still treat it as not backdrop music.
Yeah. And it's probably part of the music design, too. I mean, because the graphics in this game are very, very simple from what I've seen.
Yeah.
So overloading you with tons and tons of texture would probably be kind of a very disparate sensory overload from the music to what you're looking at. So I think that was probably a conscious decision to kind of make things a little more simple sounding as well.
Yes.
And at the same time having less of an overwhelming effect for the kind of intensity that you're facing. That's really cool.
Such a great balance that this guy struck. It's really something special, I gotta say.
This is not the kind of game that I normally play. Multitasking is just not my thing. I am very much do a thing until it's 100%, then do another thing until it's 100%. And as soon as I distract myself from one thing, I completely lose the concept of what I was doing in the first place. So I don't know. I don't know if I would be any good at this, but
I'm going to say that I believe in you because I also thought that I would never like a game like XCOM 2. I thought that a tactical strategy like that with severe resource management elements I actually didn't think I was capable of doing it. And then I was able to play it on Iron Man, which means permadeath, on veteran difficulty. And it was actually the most sustained, stressful experience I've ever had with a video game. But I did it, so I think you can do it. I think you can do it. You might not really, you might not, become a super fan of the game, but I believe that you have it in you to do it.
All right, I'll try it out. I think I have it on Steam. I think it came in a Humble Bundle quite a while ago. So maybe I'll load it up. Might be something fun to do at work when it's a slow day. Mm-hmm. Stress myself out.
Yeah, exactly. Man, work is just not stressing me out enough today.
Exactly.
Load up FTL.
So, speaking of being stressed out and not being stressed out, which I think this game does both for you, what do we have up next?
We have, for our final track that's not the closing track, Supermoon from No Man's Sky. This is for PlayStation 4, PC, Xbox One, composed by the band 65 Days of Static, comprised of Paul Walensky, Joe Shrewsbury, Rob Jones, and Simon Wright.
All right, we'll be right back. All right, we're back. That was Supermoon from No Man's Sky for the PS4, the PC, and Xbox One in 2016, composed by the band 65 Days of Static, comprised of Paul Walensky, Joe Shrewsbury, Rob Jones, and Simon Wright. I have a little bit of headcanon for how this track was recorded, if you'd like to hear it.
Oh, I would love to. I love that we've gone into these very relaxing, kind of odd voices. Continue.
Yes, I feel like it's appropriate for this song for sure. I feel like the recording engineer was like, "Hey, 65 Days of Static, I'm going to Starbucks. You guys want anything to drink?" And the whole band was like, "I'll have a chamomile tea." And the drummer was like, 42 shots of espresso, please.
Yep. In fact, that is how it went down, I believe. Notated on Wikipedia, no less. No, I'm kidding. That is really funny.
But it feels like if you removed the drum track, you would have a much calmer, very, very slow, heartfelt piece. And I'm not saying that it's not heartfelt with the drums in there, but there's a disconnect, but at the same time it changes the feel so much. And it's hard to... I mean, I know with No Man's Sky, you're basically looking at randomly generated environments for the most part. You know, it's whatever
Correct.
The AI kind of came up with for wherever you're located at that point. So, I mean, is this track just one of the kind of randomized tracks that plays while you're exploring? Or I'm going to let you kind of like babble on about this whole thing and where the song fits into the environment. I can see you preparing, revving your mental engines up.
I'm just so excited about everything that you just said. Because, in fact, everything in No Man's Sky is procedurally generated, including the music. So you'd never actually hear this track played like this. This is the official soundtrack release.
Okay.
But as you play the game, different pieces of the different songs that this band has composed will filter in and out. So actually the drum line that you specifically mentioned, the drum line will play on its own when you're being chased by things.
Oh, nice.
So like as soon as you
like
blow
that.
up a door on a certain building, it's just like and you're like, "Oh, they're coming." So yeah, so the different pieces of these tracks have been pulled out to sort of just be mishmashed at will by the game, but with certain things being triggered in certain situations also. And it's it's much more amorphous in the game. In the game, you're just gonna be walking through a field of snow, and you'll just be hearing like just that little piano line, like da,
or just that like choral segment or something, yeah,
in the background, or like the voice coming in and out a few times. And there are a couple of stings that happen, like if you pass a milestone or if you discover a certain thing, there might be like a musical sting that always sort of happens then. But for the most part, it's just kind of a very amorphous mixing together of all of these separated elements.
Yeah, dynamic music is something that I've always been really interested in trying to do an episode about. And the more I've tried to kind of explore doing that as an episode of VG Embassy, the more I'm realizing how difficult it would be to kind of do like explain what kind of situation might happen when music gets louder or, you know, more intense. So it's really nice that they can release soundtracks like this where they kind of demonstrate what kinds of sounds you might hear in a dynamic soundtrack, but kind of put it together as a cohesive song at the same time. So but I'm really, now I want to like go and find video of this game being played with this music in the background to hear
the different pieces,
how it kind of changes with the environment, because I really, really like this piece. It's really good.
And so I think too also about the dynamic audio, I think if I'm not mistaken that this was actually done in reverse. I think the track was composed like this and then it was given to the game. Sean Murray, the creator of No Man's Sky, specifically wanted this band to do the music for his game. So I think they wrote these tracks and then Sean Murray took them and unspooled them and then put them into an algorithm so that they could be mixed together as you go.
Neat.
Yeah, I think. I've not been told that necessarily directly. I do know that he asked specifically for this band to do the music. So I think that would make sense to me logically that that's how this went down.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like a cohesive song, so it makes sense that would be something like that. So No Man's Sky has changed a lot since its inception. So how early was it that you got into this game? Because it wasn't at release that you got it, right?
Correct. I only got it a year ago. I started playing it on January 9th, 2018. I know the date. This game has taken over my life. So I was playing it during the build that was the release that was called Atlas Rises.
Okay.
And now there was a major update last July called Next, in all capitals, which really overhauled the game in a lot of ways, to the point where I think it's a completely different experience now than it used to be.
Yeah.
And there's another big rollout happening this July, which is going to introduce who knows what, on top of things that we do know, like the VR component. Mm-hmm. I don't want to say too much about the game because so much of the experience is uncovering the reasons behind things. So what I'll say is that all of these major updates that are happening to the game actually have in-universe reasons for occurring, if that makes any sense. You're actually going through new eras, kind of the game, it's all built into the story.
Yeah.
But oh my gosh, I love this game so much. This game is just the absolute Emily experience. It's so good. I've put so much time and effort into cataloging everything I come across because I just like it. I taught myself how to build a wiki, and I taught myself wiki text so I could keep track of the stuff that I was discovering. I have all these headcanons for the characters that I play. But I think, so I can't really speak to how the game used to be. I mean, we all know the controversy that it didn't deliver on a lot of things that had been discussed in interviews and things.
Yeah.
But Atlas Rises to me was an amazing experience. And I actually, just as sort of a side note, I had to make a distinction after this game between plot and lore. Because people would say to me all the time, but there's no story to No Man's Sky. And I would say, what are you talking about? There's so much story. But it's lore. It's all world building that you find out piece by piece, and you uncover all of the backstories behind these species and what's going on and who you are and why you're there. But it's not like event driven. So when people were saying there was no story, they were saying they wanted plot points that didn't exist.
A motivation to, move
right,
on.
exactly.
Okay.
So it's really funny because I'll see comments from people on the internet that'll be like, oh, you could play an adorable, affable Gek. And I'm like, what? Like, how is it? But it's because, you have to put so many hours in before you can put all these things together. And this is something I love, a lot of the lore contradicts. So there are different species and their stories don't add up with each other. So I love that. So this game, to me, No Man's Sky is light sci-fi because it's so lonely. You're out there by yourself. You used to be totally isolated. Now you can multiplay with people. But there's this huge mystery overarching everything as to who you are and why you're there. It begins with you regaining consciousness and not knowing who you are, not knowing how to use any of your stuff. And by the way, I loved that as a mechanic because, a game mechanic, I should say, because you play games so often where you're supposed to be like the best shooter in the West, but you don't know the controls yet. So you're
part
like
of a SEAL team, but you're wandering around stumbling in the dark.
Yeah, exactly. You're running into walls for no reason. So in this game, it was actually part of the experience to not know how to use anything and to figure it out all on your own and to try not to die and to survive. And I connected so much with that because I really felt like more than any other game I'd ever played that I was the character, that there was no distinction between me and this avatar. And when I played the game, it was all first person as well, so I never saw my own face. So I was like, Who am I? So I think that for me, a lot of light sci-fi comes down to this thing called Yugen. So on the VGM Jukebox, we talked a lot about Mono no Awade and about Wabi Sabi. And there's this other kind of Japanese philosophical thing called Yugen. I was just having a conversation with patron JT about it. And Yugen is like the mystery of possibilities. It's not explaining things that you can just imagine the possibilities. So it's the word, it's really hard for me to explain, but it's the word for the loneliness that I love in games. Like Echo the Dolphin, Yugen, all over. Metroid, Yugen, all over. And so I feel like the way No Man's Sky is set up, incorporates that. And so that kind of, I feel like that's light sci-fi to me, because again, that's the expansive possibilities and like the endlessness as opposed to
what you can do in an open world versus a linear path.
Right. Or like narrowing down to like, here is the source, here is the problem, here is
right.
So I love No Man's Sky. I know it's not for everyone, but I have said for years, even before No Man's Sky was even announced or even a thing that anybody knew about, I used to say, like, if someone would just invent a game where I could just look up at the sky and see other planets, I would play that game, even if that was all you could do. So, that's No Man's Sky. I mean, there's more to do, but I just get chills all the time while I'm playing. When you look up and you just see you're on a moon and you just see another planet taking up like 80% of the sky. So good.
That's cool.
Yeah.
It's funny because Hello Games, the developer of No Man's Sky, I almost feel like they are their own light sci-fi story. Like if you were like in the 80s looking forward in the future to like this software company that's made all these promises about this huge expansive game they're making and launching and kind of failing on almost all of those promises, and then even in the face of a gaming community that's like metaphorically throwing like rocks at them,
and literally there were death threats.
They were getting death threats. Yeah,
they had to call police and all that stuff.
It was crazy, and overcoming this adversity and kind of pushing through and delivering on those promises and actually providing more than they promised as the game aged and went on and got updated and is still getting updated. It's like you saw on Steam, the player ratings of the game going from extremely negative to mostly negative to mixed to mostly positive, and it's just climbing, and they're like learning as they go, and it's showing in the games that they're releasing. So it's just a really kind of feel-good story, and something like how to do a game right when you've originally done it wrong. And I wish a lot of companies will take note of what Hello Games has done and learn from their experience and try to deliver on better games as they go into the future and not make the same mistakes. You know what I mean? So I would hope maybe someday there would be a documentary about the making of this game, and I'd like to see the behind the scenes of how this all went down.
I agree. I love everything that you just said about the arc of Hello Games being its own light sci-fi story, because it was a passion project. It was such a small team. I think they had 16 or 15 people working on it in the beginning.
Yeah.
And they, in the face of all of this negativity, they loved the project so much that they weren't trying to prove, I don't think they were trying to prove anything to the world. I think they just wanted to make the game that they wanted so badly.
See their vision, yeah.
Right. And so they kept working on it. And it should also be said that all of these major updates, these overhauls, have all been free. So you buy the game once and then you will get these updates. So they're not even charging for that stuff. I think that what Hello Games went through is one of the greatest video game turnaround success stories that I know of. And I feel almost privileged to have seen it. I love them. And I love that you said that they're like a light sci-fi thing, because I feel like I love them as a company. And that I love them as people almost because of what they've done. And I feel like, there are a lot of companies now that are making they're saying things in interviews, or they're making decisions that might make you kind of feel bad as a player, or sort of like, there's people get offended by things and all of that. So yeah. I just love that there's nothing that I'm upset with them about. I just admire them, and I love that they are finally getting the recognition that I think that they should have had a long time ago. And even though it doesn't really matter, I'm just glad that they can have this validation, because they deserve it.
Sure. I mean, they could have just dumped this project and let the universe rot away, but they decided to make things right, and at no additional charge to the people that jumped on board early. So
right.
Kudos to them. Oh, man. Well, that about does it. We have one closing track. Why don't we talk about that first before we go on with the closing notes of the show? So what are we going to close out with tonight?
We're going to close out with a track from a Star Trek game, because I really felt like we're talking about light sci-fi. We should really represent Star Trek here. So this is from Star Trek Online, Legacy of Romulus, which came out for Mac, PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One. The composer is Kevin Manthe, and this is New Romulus. And I chose this because I just think this is a gorgeous track. It's very ambient. It's so beautiful. It, at one point, makes me, like, squint because the chords hit me so hard, you know what I mean? So I just thought it would be a really nice meditative note to go out on as we all ponder what is and is not light sci-fi.
So we'll listen to that at the end of the show. And yeah, so thank you, Emily, for hanging out with me. That was awesome. I learned so much. There are a ton of games that I really want to check out now, and some fantastic soundtracks that I didn't even know existed. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on. And I mean, I think 50% of this stuff I didn't know either. So it was an exploration through the great unknown, infinity and beyond for both of us.
We're living our own light sci-fi stories.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for observing the non-smoking policy in here, by the way. When you go back to your dark sci-fi land, you can start smoking.
Oh, yeah. It's so oxygen rich in light sci-fi land, we would just all explode as soon as a cigarette
That's
got
true.
lit.
And in dark sci-fi, it's like everyone's lungs are poisoned anyway, so why not?
You may as well. And with this, you're just getting pure O2 pumped into the air, so we're all gonna...
That's right.
So, where can we find your podcast on the interwebs?
So you can find Soundtest Roulette at soundtestroulette.com. It's a little tiny project that I'm doing. I'm actually not sure how long I'm still going to be doing it, actually. So that remains to be seen. But yeah, for now, it's a once-a-month podcast where I randomize 7 tracks based on a theme, which might be tight or might be loose. And we try to uncover things that maybe we haven't heard before. So I love doing roulette style. Oh, hey, speaking of roulette, I brought your roulette wheel with me.
Sweet. Okay, we're going to have to install that. Yeah, because I kind of miss it. You know, I was very against it when we put it up originally, but...
That's right, but
you've got this big gaping hole in my table that just needs to be filled.
Well, now we can put the Guy Fieri roulette wheel in it, so yes. It's all set. I hand-painted the flames myself.
Awesome. Welcome to Flavortown.
So that's where I am. I also stream on Twitch, and I think I'm trying to roll out a more aggressive streaming schedule. So, check out twitch.tv/keyglyph and see what my schedule is. I should have eventually a little image that's up when I'm not streaming that has the schedule, but I'm doing retro stuff on one night. I'm doing ongoing playthroughs occasionally on another, and then also I'm going to start streaming from my Apple IIe, which I'm very excited about. So using the real hardware to sort of re-explore that computer and also read the documents that I wrote between the ages of 7 and 12, which are
very, very cool,
hilariously bizarre. So
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, so check me out if you guys are into that kind of thing.
Cool. And we'll have information on where to access your stuff in the show notes of this episode. Speaking of which, I would love to thank Indira J., otherwise known as Metal Sorcery, for the art for the show, and Trevin Hughes, a.k.a. Dread, for the podcast theme song. Guys, if you're listening on iTunes, you can check us out on there, and please leave us a rating if you enjoy what you're hearing. That'll help the show get a little more visibility for people that are searching for cool VGM podcasts. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/The VG Embassy, or on Twitter at The VG Embassy. You can head over to thevgembassy.com, and from there you can jump off to our Patreon page or our Discord channel. Either place is really cool to communicate with me and or subscribe to our Patreon feed, in which you will get a bonus episode every month of me and my buddies Joe and Todd talking about current video game events and playing some cool musical tracks with some very cool participation aspects to that show as well. Speaking of our Patreon patrons, I'd like to thank, at our tourist level, Chris Murray, Cameron Childs, and Michael Bridgewater from the Forever Sound Version podcast. Our VG emissaries, Chris Myers, Donovan Orofino, Ben the Dyad Dishman, John Jekyll, Chris Steenerson, Jordan Worma from the Table to Stage podcast, and Volt Supreme. Our audio attaché members, Cameron Worma, Carlos, and Scott McElhone. And as always, our VG ambassador, the patron saint of VGM podcasts, Mr. Alex, the messenger. All right. Once again, Emily, thank you so much for hanging out, and I hope that you will visit the embassy again in the very near light sci-fi future.
Oh, thank you so much. I will be back for sure. And VG Embassy visitors, please start a mega thread as to what counts as light sci-fi or not.
Yes.
I want to see this debate unfold.
I want some good examples and some good controversial games, something that might be dark or light, depending on how you look at it, because that's the stuff that interests me the most. The stuff that floats in the middle between the two, you know?
Gray sci-fi, maybe that's another episode
Gray
you'll
sci-fi.
do.
I like it. All right, we will see you back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.